Hi, I'm Dan Cortopassi. Welcome to Model Building Tips. In this episode, I'm going to talk about doing some maintenance on N-scale engines to make them run better after they've been stored for a really long time. Nicole and I recently set up this little temporary layout on our dining table, and as we were pulling some of my engines out of storage, we noticed that a few of them didn't run very well or at all. And for the most part, these are Kados and Atlas engines and other good quality equipment that normally runs really well. So we were kind of trying to figure out what was going on. And one of the things I discovered is that over time, if something has been stored, a locomotive has been stored for years, the lubrication can actually congeal, and instead of lubricating the engine, it actually acts kind of like a glue. So that's what happened to a couple of these. And all it really needed was a disassembly and cleaning and then putting them back together to make them run better. So I'm going to go through a few examples of how I did that, and some were better than others, so some of the examples will be a little more involved. But anyway, just wanted to share what I'm doing in case anyone else is having the same problem. Most of these engines were bought between, say, 2006 and 2016. I do have some N-scale stuff from when I was a kid, but that's not what's on the table right now. So they're not that old, but they've been stored probably for at least 5 or more years without having been run. So, stuff can happen in that amount of time. So let's go check out some examples and see how I fixed it. Many of the locomotives ran just fine when I put them on the track, but some didn't. The locomotives have power when I put them on the track, and I can control the lights. When I try to get them to move, however, they either stand still or they go really slow. I'm a firm believer in less is more when it comes to locomotive lubrication, especially in N-scale. They do need some lubricant though. When a locomotive is stored for an extended period, several years in this case, the lubricants can dry up or sometimes even congeal. When relubing model trains, I can't stress enough how important it is to use lubricants sparingly. These models are tiny, they don't need much. Also, always use plastic compatible lubricants made for hobby use. Most of these models have plastic gears. If you use any old oil from a hardware store, it may attack the plastic and cause the gears to erode or fall apart over time. At that point, your engine is a paperweight. For this project, I'll be using several products. One is electrical contact cleaner. This one is a spray that's safe for use on all electronics. It has a nozzle that can be set to low, medium, and high. Low is usually best for model trains. It's also good for cleaning track. This is Labelle 106 white grease. It's a plastic compatible grease and is good to use on model gears. This is a conductive lubricating oil by Atlas, called Conductilube. Bachmann also makes a similar product, and there are others. This oil is plastic compatible and will conduct electricity, so it's good for most applications, including wheel bearings and other contact surfaces. I'll also be using some Kapton tape, a thin electrical insulating tape that's very useful for DCC installations. This locomotive's headlights work when I put it on the track, but it doesn't move. First, I'll pull the shell off. Most N-scale diesels can be taken apart by gripping the fuel tank in one hand and the shell in the other and pulling in opposite directions. Now that I have the chassis exposed, I want to make sure that the motor can turn. I can spin it with my fingers and I don't feel any resistance, so that's good. If there were congealed lubricants, it would likely be difficult to turn. I'll put the chassis back on and try again. It's not likely, but there's a chance that some part of the shell could have been rubbing on the mechanism and preventing it from turning. I'm cranking the throttle up as far as it will go. Still nothing. So now we know that the shell isn't the issue. Most Atlas locomotives have a light board, or in this case a DCC decoder, that's sandwiched between the two halves of the metal frame. The electrical path depends on 4 contact points, 2 on either side of the decoder. If these aren't making good contact, then the engine won't run. In this case, though, the lights are working, so chances are there's nothing wrong here. Copper strips extend up from the motor and touch the bottom of the decoder. If this electrical path is interrupted, then the motor won't turn even if the lights work. I'm going to carefully spray a small amount of electrical contact cleaner in this area. Still nothing. Next, I'll try some conductive lubricating oil on the motor bearings and brushes. Sometimes more comes out of the bottle than I'd like, so it's important to pay attention to how I'm holding the bottle. I'll wipe off excess oil with a paper towel. Unfortunately, the engine is still not running. At this point, I'm going to have to start tearing down the chassis to see what's going on. I'll start by removing the fuel tank. Next, I'll take out the 2 screws that hold the halves of the chassis together. Be sure to do this over something that will catch loose parts. The trucks, screws, and other small pieces may fall out at this point. Check the trucks by rolling them on the track. They should roll very freely. If not, then they may have congealed lubricant and will need to be cleaned. These are good. I still suspect that the motor contacts may be the problem. This is what I was talking about earlier. The two copper strips that come up from the motor need to make good contact with the pads on the bottom of the decoder. The motor contacts on this model look a little dirty. I'll clean them with a microbrush soaked in contact cleaner. Before I go any further, I'm going to hook up some test clips to the motor leads and make sure that the motor is still good. This is where it pays to keep a DC power pack around even if you run DCC. Hey, it works. While I have the model apart, I'll put a tiny drop of oil on the worm bearings. I suspect this is a factory DCC decoder. When I do an install, I like to use Kapton tape. I've wrapped a piece around the chassis in the area near the motor leads to make sure that there's no chance that they'll short out against the frame. As I'm working on putting things back together, I think I figured out what's going on. One of the motor contacts is hitting the bottom of the decoder board in the wrong place. It's hitting the insulated green part instead of the metal contact pad. Before putting everything back together, I want to make sure those contacts are in the right places. Then I'll carefully reassemble the frame. Before I snap the trucks back into place, I'll put a tiny dab of white grease on each worm. Let's try the chassis again. It works. And one last time with the shell on. It's running really well now. This Kado SD70MAC is also not working. As with the Atlas SD35, I can control the lights, but the locomotive won't move. This one is making a noise like it's trying to move though, so I suspect the cause is different. This one has a Digitrax DCC decoder that I installed myself some time ago. I'll start by removing the shell. I'm trying to rotate the motor by hand and it's resisting. It looks like I'll need to disassemble the chassis. Decoders for Kado locomotives slip right out. I'll need to remove the screws that hold the chassis halves together. And I'll also need to remove the Kapton tape. Now I can pry the chassis apart. The motor still doesn't want to turn. Next, I'll remove the worm assemblies so I can figure out which part is sticking. With the worms removed, the motor spins freely. It looks like the problem is with the bearings on each end of the worm. These are really hard to turn. I suspect old lubricant is congealed and is now acting like glue. I managed to pull one bearing off. See the green gunk around the shaft? That's old lubricant. I'll scrape off the worst of it. Then I'll get the rest with a microbrush soaked in contact cleaner. Rubbing alcohol would also work. Now the bearing can spin much more easily. I cleaned the bearing on the inside of the worm too. It wasn't nearly as bad. The bearings are held in place by prongs in the metal frame. They have to be put in square or they won't fit. Everything is spinning now like it should. Before putting everything back together, I'll use a tiny drop of oil on all the bearings. I don't want to use too much and recreate the problem in the future. There were no issues with the trucks on this model, but I still like to roll them to make sure. These aren't quite as free rolling as the ones in the Atlas SD35 we looked at earlier, but they're still pretty good. Before I snap the trucks back into place, I'll put a tiny dab of white grease on each worm. I'll need to replace the Kapton tape that I removed when I took the chassis apart. Only the piece in the center near the motor contacts is essential. Without it, the decoder can short out. I like to use a little additional tape for insurance. Now I can reinstall the decoder. It's important that the contacts on the front of the decoder fit under the tabs in the chassis. Also, the motor leads need to be tucked under the metal tabs coming down from the decoder board. Let's give the chassis a test. It looks like it's working now. All that's left is to put the shell back on. My model of BNSF 9647 is now back in operation. This locomotive runs but is very slow. It's at full throttle right now. Let's open it up and take a look. Unlike the Kado SD70MAC we looked at, I can spin the motor in this one without trouble. Rather than disassemble the chassis completely, I'm going to just loosen the two screws that hold it together but not back them all the way out. Then I can use a screwdriver to pry the frame halves apart enough to get the trucks out. Now I'll use a tiny drop of oil on each end of the worms. I'll also put a small dab of white grease in the center of the worm itself. I'll put a small drop of oil on each end of the motor shaft too. You can't really see them, but the motor bearings are next to the flywheels toward the center of the locomotive. Another drop on the commutator should help conductivity. Don't put much oil in here. Now I'll put the trucks back on and retighten the screws. The chassis is running much better now. I'll put the shell back on and call this one done. This locomotive is running, but it's a little sluggish. I'll need to remove the shell. I'll start by removing the front coupler. Spreading the lower edges of the shell slightly will release it from the chassis. Now the shell will pull off. I'll remove the screws so I can move the decoder. This is a wired install, so I need to be careful not to break the wires or soldered connections. Now that the decoder is out of the way, I'll put a tiny drop of oil on the motor bearings. Once that's done, I'll put the decoder back in place. The trucks on this model pop out easily. I'll put a small drop of oil on the worm bearings and a dab of white grease on the worms. These trucks don't roll as freely as some of the other engines I've looked at, but they're still pretty good. I can see by looking at the sheen on the gears that they already have a little bit of lube on them, so I'm going to leave them alone. I'll put the chassis on the track to test it. The model is running much more smoothly now. All that's left is to put the shell back on and replace the front coupler. So that's going to do it for this episode. A lot of the engines had similar problems, so I didn't show how to fix every single one because it was kind of like, more of the same. There's the more severe cases that have to be completely disassembled, and then there's other ones that just need to be opened up and given a very small amount of lubrication. I will stress again, even though I've already said it, don't over-lubricate model trains, especially N-scale. They really don't need a lot. They're very tiny. And a little goes a long way. So anyway, good luck with your model railroading, and thanks for watching.